Welcome back. In this video we are going to be talking about articulation and string techniques. Articulation is the way a note is played, which is a kind of vague definition, but it's easier to understand if we look at some examples. For example, one kind of articulation is legato, which means to play notes smoothly and joined together with no gaps in between them. Just nice and smooth and joined together, and kind of the default for how we would play music. The opposite of legato is staccato, which means to play notes short and separately. With gaps in between them. On a music notation, we show the difference between these two with a nice smooth curved line for legato and short separate dots above each note for staccato. A really great example of how useful these articulations are is in the Emperor Quartet, which you just listened to. In the first variation, we only hear two violins and they're playing in a similar range, so it would be very difficult to tell them apart. However, what the composer does is he gives them different articulations at the beginning when they're playing similar notes. As a consequence, the first violin sounds very different to the second violin, even though they are technically playing very similar or actually the same notes sometimes. So this creates an extra layer of contrast without having to find different notes for them to play. And then over here, he takes away the staccato articulation in the accompaniment to provide contrast and variety within the part itself. So without having to actually change any notes, the composer is able to add an extra layer of variety and interest and to change the sounds with very little additional effort or detail. In addition to these, a composer for a string quartet might want to use specific string techniques to create a similar sort of contrast. The two main techniques that composers will use in the classical and romantic periods are arco, which is your standard moving a bow back and forth across some violin strings that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, and pizzicato, which means to pluck a string, often like this. Now, sadly, I don't actually own a violin, and I am having to record this in my own home, so I cannot demonstrate for you right now what these techniques look and sound like. However, I have provided a series of links showing you as clearly as I can find the difference between these two techniques and the difference in the sound. I would describe the differences to the sound as arco is very full, it lends itself to legato articulation, it sounds very sort of rich, like full proper notes, whereas pizzicato often sounds very sort of short, kind of stunted, much quieter a lot of the time. So kind of similar to the difference between legato and staccato, which is something we have to address, because we don't want to mix them up. So if we had to tell the difference between staccato and pizzicato, we are listening for that difference in timbre. We are listening for that slight difference between the pluck and the bow, and that's something you're going to need to practice in just a moment. So, after this video, move on to this exercise, listening through all the examples. There are answers in the slideshow, so you can mark it yourself. Again, very important to learn how to tell the difference between these two, so you're not mixing them up in an exam situation. After this, there is then an exercise where you pull together all of the terminology and ideas from this lesson and use it to describe string quartets in a lot of detail, which is our aim for the end of today's lesson. Once you've done all of that, and you are confident with it all, and you've done all the exercises, then move on to the plenary exercise where you can show your teacher what you know. Alright guys, you will see me again in a week's time. Day's time, because we're actually having a lesson tomorrow. See you guys tomorrow. Have a great lesson.